recording again. Lovely, thanks, Nathan. Okay. Are we raring for part 2? We refueled? Hope so. Right, so we are going to move on now to a series of reports which are different but related. And Gareth, I hope you've got a glass of water next to you because you're taking quite a lot of the next items all in quick succession. So I hope you're well hydrated. Good. So we'll start off with item number 12. So this is our equal pay statement and pay gap report for 2025. Is that right? Over to you.
Thank you. So as noted in the report, this is a requirement to be published every 4 years and a pay gap every 2 years. So there is a duality every 4 years. So the report, what has happened at a national level, agreed to HRDs, is an agreed, if you like, template pro forma about how to frame the equal pay statement. So there's consistency to it, and that's noted in the background section of the report. There was some feedback on that initially in terms of the first draft, particularly in relation to noting some aspects of equal pay are societal orientated, and that a lot of the processes we have in place in NHS Scotland, including Agenda for Change, are based on the principles of equal pay for equal value of work, if you like, in terms of the job evaluation process. So what we tend to see is that occupational segregation tends to be one of the things we see in relation to protected characteristics. So there is still work that we can be doing in and around that, and probably that relates, I pick up later on the agenda, we've got employability. Again, that's an element of looking at how do we change the images of what potentially people I suppose of any age actually, but in terms of getting out into the community and saying, making certain jobs more attractive to areas where they're underrepresented for whatever reason. But if I take sex, then we know that, for example, estates and facilities is an area where we have quite distinct balances of, we have a lot of people that work in estates that tend to be male, and that is changing over time. And similarly, facilities has tended to be dominated by female over the years. So I think it's about how we position that as encouraging people to adopt jobs in caring roles and vice versa. It did actually come up as a national HRDs last week in relation to then there being, because there was a question around recruitment and retention premia, and that potential to skew whether that was related to sex. But what we noted was the ones we've got in place in the Highland in relation to estates and facilities, particularly in skilled trades, where we're competing with the commercial market. So it's more to do with the reason for the premium is to do with the commercial market, and because that sector of our workforce is dominated by men, then that's why there's an association with the premium and the male sex. So there's a bit of complexity. I just wanted to sort of pause on that a little bit to say that's probably the area that we need to think about in terms of how we work within the context of wider societal norms and what's perceived as norms for different professions. Other than that, I'm not going to go any further than that. There's a lot of information in the report, and I'll stop there and take any questions.
That's great. Thanks, Gareth. And I suppose, yeah, I've maybe got some questions which, like you said, possibly actually sit more in the employability strategy paper that we're going to take later on more than anything else. I suppose, I'll open up for questions and comments from others. I might have missed this, and I apologize, I didn't get time to read the full, the Close the Gap report that we had a hyperlink to as well. I possibly just missed it, but what I couldn't see was how our gap compares to other NHS boards and how maybe we've improved or not over the years. So I've either not picked that up or it's something that I would welcome seeing in the future, just to get a sense of where we sit in the pack and if we're moving in the right direction or not. But the other bit I just wanted to pick up, and again, it's maybe something to look at in the future, is I recognize that this is a requirement and we have to report on this, and the parameters of that reporting have kind of been set for us. It is interesting though that it excludes overtime. Um and there'll be a reason for that, but I suppose actually even that in and of itself, it would be fascinating to look at who is able to take advantage of overtime, I guess, if that's the way you want to phrase it, and who isn't. And I suppose then we start to dig into, like you've said, maybe some societal norms around caring responsibilities or other pressures and constraints. But I think when you consider that, what people take home in their pay packet is made up of their core salary and any opportunities for additional work points overtime, that's the bit that kind of matters to people. So it would be interesting to understand why that has been excluded.
I'll maybe come back on that point first off. I suspect, but I couldn't confirm, that is probably to do with the level of maturity of what we can get out of our systems, and to be able to multivariate analysis, I think. I think we can. Would be my suspicion that actually trying to get overtime data out and pay is probably quite complex.
Okay. Steve, I'll bring you in, please.
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, Gareth, it was just at 2.3, just looking at the I think I know the answer. So but I'm not asking a question I know the answer to. I don't mean to be like that. But on the disability gap, and just looking at the numbers there, where there's a missing group of people who don't really respond in terms of whether they have a disability. So I guess it's the confidence rating in terms of the very low percentage of proportionately, I would say, of people who declare a disability. So it's just trying to get a confidence rating in terms of, do we really have a feel for the workforce and those with disabilities who might need reasonable adjustments, but we just don't know. So it's a slightly different question to the gap, but I think there's about quite a high percentage there that haven't said either way whether they do or don't have a disability. And I'm just interested in your thoughts, because it's an interesting piece of data.
Yeah, happy to answer that one. And I would say it's a common, come back partly to your point, Sarah. I can't give you the data across different boards, but I can certainly do relatively recent comparison to where I've been previously. And that figure is in most boards I understand is a challenge. Now, without going into too much detail, I was also part of the Ability Network, which was the lived experience group who had Golden Jubilee that explored some of this. And some of the things that came out of that is partly to do with terminology. So some people don't consider themselves to be disabled, even though they might be living with a long-term condition. And there's an element of the so what. So what if, like, there's two parts to that: is what difference does it make, and if I actually sort of register to be disabled. So I think there's a couple of I put it in there, and I think part of that is the reporting side of things, because we are dependent on it's voluntary, or whether people disclose it or not. So I think you're right. It probably doesn't reflect the true nature of who has a range of conditions that may affect their ability to be at work or not, as the case may be. But I think it's also related to, do we dig below that and understand from people with lived experience what the issues are for them? So what do we need to do to proactively? So I think we can still focus on that being something that we articulate more positively around why there's benefits to indicating if you have a disability. I think there's a more interesting concept of how do we also articulate that the label of disability isn't necessarily what everybody uses when they consider. So, for example, if you've had cancer, then I only knew this from personal lived experience of my wife having cancer over the last few years. Once you've had cancer, you can effectively you can take a label of being disabled. So that's an interesting one, but a lot of people would not consider themselves to be disabled once they've had cancer and they've recovered. So that's just to give you a real live example.
Did you want to come back in, Steve?
Sorry for
That's okay.
re-attacking, but yeah, I'm really encouraged by that. I just want to say, I think you know, for people who may not want to, who may be discouraged from disclosing a disability because of the impact that might have on their employment, Gareth, if we can change that, you know, that whole narrative around to say, no, we are a really responsible employer. We're here to help, and if you do have a disability, in the long term, it's better for you and it's better for us if you disclose that, because we will make those adjustments that you need to allow you to perform your duties effectively. So I'm really encouraged by that. That, you know, if we can have some sort of campaign around that, that'd be terrific. Thanks.
Yeah, just coming back on that briefly, there is a national policy being developed on reasonable adjustments. And I think Golden Jubilee, we developed our own policy in that context, because part of this is actually to also support our managers to be able to think about reasonable adjustments and how to do that well and how to have that conversation, so that you create the right environment that people then, it's not just the organisation says, but people actually experience it and feel it, and it's how they experience the workplace. So that national piece will be helpful for us, but I think then it becomes, as you say, both campaign but also about education, and it's one of the things we're getting feedback around from staff as well. Is it's a slightly unfortunate terminology, but the capability process, again, it's funny how words can be a barrier. So capability is part of that process that covers a range of different things. So when you come back, and if you're not fit or well enough to do your job as it was, that's the policy that applies as a capability policy. So it's one of these things that we'll have to think about how we reframe some of it, to say actually that's then about reasonable adjustments. And there's definitely something where it's seen as pejorative, because that's in the same policy it applies to how you might also manage people out of the organisation, on a fair basis, where they can no longer do their job for whatever reason of performance or capability, because of their physical health and well-being. So it's a really interesting area to get into.
Thanks. And like we were saying earlier, this suite of papers that we're looking at right now all really link in with each other. And I'm really thinking about that employability paper that we're looking at in a minute as well, and where we can pick some of that up under that item. Jerry, I'll take you, please.
Thank you, Sarah. Gareth, and this may well tie into the employability paper as Sarah has spoken about. So I suppose what I was left with, having looked at all that wealth of data, which is in all the tables, you are very much left with the so what question. So I really would, much as Sarah has appreciated, has articulated I think, is it 4 years ago? I think it's every 4 years we have to publish it in this level of detail in the actual statement every 2 years. So yeah, so it would be interesting to understand the movement from one period to another period. But I think for me, the far more interesting bit there is how have we influenced that movement? Because if we fundamentally accept that Agenda for Change is an equal pay system, and I say we'll maybe get into more discussions in the employability paper in a few minutes. Does that infer therefore that any other changes are just happen chance depending on who left, who retired, who recruited, etc., etc., etc.? So I'm really interested in that attribution to positive actions, which really gets into the papers about the progress reports and the outcome frameworks. So probably just I wrote a load of random thoughts there, but it really interesting stuff, Gareth. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree, and again, I'm not, I haven't gone back over the approach to this in Highland previously, but I can reflect on that was definitely one of my key steers for the team that I was working with previously, around the so what. So there's a tendency to publish the data, and then not actually draw any conclusions from it. And that was both for this report, but there's an interaction with the workforce monitoring report, which is your fuller set of reporting against protected characteristics of the workforce in general. This is obviously a correlation between protected characteristics and the pay. So again, I would encourage us to then have the so what, and there is a little bit of that within this paper, but I think that can be developed further as we go, with further iterations of both this report and the workforce monitoring report.
Thanks, Gareth. And just while you were talking, you triggered something that I remembered from a recent meeting. And this, like you said, this is a very kind of structured report, and that's fine. So my point that I'm going to make now probably sits either more within the paper we've just taken before lunch around the EDI strategy, or will sit under employability. But it was when I was doing the discretionary points work, and so this kind of is almost under the same, well, no, it's a bit different from overtime, but it was recognizing the number of, you know, a certain type of person who will proactively apply to you know, get their extra work recognized and put, you know, record extra work and apply for extra points, versus perhaps other groups of employees who do the same job but are maybe more reluctant. So that's obviously more around, like you said, the kind of societal norms, that the cultural element of who's pushing forwards in certain aspects of having their work recognized and who isn't. And I think that's really interesting. And I don't know if we were ever looking for kind of little pilot projects or things to test some of our EDI strategy or our employability stuff around. I suspect there will be many other examples similar to discretionary points where we can look at it and say, you know, of a cohort of people within a certain profession or job group or whatever, who are the ones that are pushing forward and getting recognition or taking those steps up a ladder, and who are the ones that are not, and how do we, and as Jerry said, so what, you know, what do we do about that? It's just a thought that kind of popped into my head while you were talking.
Oh, that's a fascinating area as well. We did, again, with the previous medical director, he actually did the bulk of the work, but around discretionary points, did do some analysis around protected characteristics in that space. I think the challenge in that is it's a relatively small data set, so you quite quickly get into disclosure issues. So you have to be thoughtful and careful about how you do it. But I think it's a good point. And I suppose some of this might be thinking about what can we expand out a bit more in terms of think about, well, that's a characteristic of our medical workforce. Do we understand some of the things? Because I think beyond the discretionary points, there is a whole raft of element of variables that come into job planning as well. So because discretionary points is intended to be over and above what your job plan is. However, there's also the element of, do we have an equitable and fair approach to additional contractual elements that go above the standard contract of 10 sessions? That's a whole element of how do you get into a service-based approach, recognizing that job planning as an individual conversation. It does also then factor into, yes, but are you having a conversation as a group of consultants about how you divide up and share some of those responsibilities? So you rightly highlight a challenge, an area that's something that needs to be looked at. But I think if you wind it back to, if we can have the principles of parity and equity in general, it helps us think about, actually, we avoid zeroing in on any particular areas. This just might help us highlight where particular things, there might need to be a particular focus. But no, very good point.
Yeah, okay, good. And Alex, please.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm very interested in paper, Gareth. Thanks very much. A lot of statistics, a lot of numbers, a lot of data, but it's slightly skewed in terms of the overall numbers and the outcome. Basically, it's 400 people that are forcing us up from not too bad, less than £1, to round about the £4 an hour. And it's dental and consultants that are doing that. Is there any way you can take that out? If you follow me, because it is skewing the overall number that you've got there, primarily because A, there's not a lot of them, and B, they're some of the highest paid, which again is reflecting on the overall median. I'm like Jerry though. The first question I had when I read it was, what were we doing before? Is this improving? Is it not? Now, at the very start of the paper, it says it is, but there's nothing to demonstrate that in the rest of the paper. And then the next bit is and So what we're going to do about it, especially when it's so skewed in terms of the overall outcome. Thanks.
Yeah, no, certainly. I think that's something we could think about. You're right to identify that, and interesting enough, I think segregating it into further analysis by pay groups would be helpful for us to look at that, which think we have done that to some extent. So I think it's about how you read into each of these areas, and medical's an interesting one from a sex perspective, but it's also an interesting one in terms of race as well. You also get quite significant variation in there as well. So it's worth thinking about. But I think because it's so multifactorial, I think you have to look at it, cut it and dice it in different ways and think about it in different ways.
Okay, that a helpful statement to finish that on, because we could get dragged into the depths of the data, but I think that's helpful, and it's good for us to be talking about this, particularly within the context of the suite papers that we have in front of us today. Okay, so we are being asked to note the content of that report and take substantial assurance that gives us confidence of compliance with the legislation, the policy and the objectives, recognising, as we said, it's quite a structured report for a specific reason. Are we happy with that? Yep. I'll just fill a little bit, Gareth, to take a breath, and then on to the next one.
No,
We have item number 13. So this is our equalities, outcomes and mainstreaming report. Over to you.
Okay, so it's important to highlight that this is joint piece of work across Public Health and People Directorate, and Gail's taken a lead on pulling that together, but working with colleagues to look back over the last 2 years and the progress against the equality outcomes for the previous period, which we're coming to the end of. So again, you can see the outcomes highlighted that were agreed at the beginning of that period in 2021. And then the detail of the information, we pulled out some specific elements around workforce elements as well. And I'll stop there because there's a lot of detail in there, and it probably comes back to points made earlier around the balance between having quantitative data and qualitative data in these reports. Mainstream reports tend to be a mixture of the two, and I'll leave it there.
That's great, thank you, Gareth. Okay, any questions or comments around the mainstream report? Oh, good. Tim, I'll bring you in, please.
Thanks. It's really to just to seek to put this in a wider context. Clearly, it needs to be seen in the context of inequalities. There are a whole wide range of different inequalities, and some equalities relate to differences in how in protected characteristics and how we regard those, and but it can also then be extended to wider equalities. Often when we think about health inequalities, we think about just income inequalities, but it does go far wider than that, and this is one example of that. And I think the challenge for us is to seek both to mainstream the inequalities agenda so that we're looking at that for everything, including those protected characteristics and other high profile inequalities issues, but also when it comes to what we're doing for mitigating the inequalities to make sure that that's mainstreamed as well, and that while small scale work and niche work's really important and can make big differences in people's lives, we need to think about how we get those mainstream. And I think the work that the board will be doing in terms of having a more systematic and integral approach to health inequalities will include that, but we need to make sure that is included in the agenda.
Thanks, Tim. Yeah, that's helpful, and I had written down actually in my notes around those links as well, so I'm glad you came in on that point. I've got Emily next, please.
Thanks, Sarah. Gareth, I just had a question around whether it's just Highland covered by this, because the carer section, there's a breakdown by area, but it's only got areas within Highland in it. And if it is just Highland, where's Argyll and Bute reporting?
That's a good question. I don't have the answer to that one, so maybe you need to come back to you on that. I don't know whether there's anything Tim wants to add to that.
No, I mean it should. It's board duty, so I think it should include everything. So, but I think we'll need to.
Well, let's take an action, shall we, just to clarify that offline, and we can update board members. We can get that detail and clarify that offline. Okay, I've got Karen next, please.
Yeah, similar to Emily, I'm struggling to see what areas this is reporting against across our Pan Highland areas. And I think similar to the conversation that we had earlier around that areas for collaboration and identifying areas of joint working, I think it would be really good to start to see some of that being kind of brought through in this work. But it feels very Highland focused, as in the north. Thanks.
Okay, so we'll pick that up under the same action. And Jerry, please.
Thank you, Sarah. I mean, I found the entire report really, really helpful and informative. I suppose just the way my brain works, I immediately started looking for what is the measurable impact that all of these excellent activities have had, and it takes us right back to that discussion about, well, how do you measure things that actually would stop happening? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question. So I can see how many activities we've provided, how many people we've trained, how many interventions we've had, and I really, really enjoyed all of that. But my brain did start thinking about, well, how do we actually measure the impact, if possible, that this had on inequalities, on positive health outcomes? And I know that's a tremendously difficult question to answer, so I'm just leaving it out there. I did have a couple of points. One of them is a potential rabbit hole, which we probably don't want to go down today, but I will. The first one I've got is actually on page 151 of the pack, 151 of 3T2, and it just goes back to my bit about corporate parenting, because it refers to the Highland Council Promise Board. Which I don't actually think it is. I think it's the Promise Board for the Highlands, but I think it just goes back to that point I had earlier. And my other one, which was actually the potential rabbit hole, and I'm happy for someone to speak to me offline. It's the sentence in page 151 about the perinatal and infant mental health service, where it says, within the context of infant mental health, the team is currently unable to deliver direct interventions with infants, but has been able to assist other teams. So I just actually wondered, so it's not actually getting to do with the outcomes. I just wondered what's preventing that team actually having direct intervention with infants and families. And I appreciate that might not be a topic for discussion today, and we might want to take it offline, and maybe Louise or someone get back to me. Thank you, Sarah.
Thanks, Jerry. That's a really good question. So I'm assuming that'll be one that we have to take away and come back to you on, so we can pick that up as an action. Just linking us back to something we said earlier, I do think what would be really helpful would be, as you said earlier, Gareth, a bit of a map, if you like, showing us how these things fit together. Because I suppose depends how you read your papers, doesn't it? As I was reading this one, and I had some questions about, so in the future, how will we as a board see the progress and the impact of this work being reported? But then, of course, it links into so many of the other papers that we're looking at today as well. So I think, as you've suggested, Gareth, at some point it would be good to take a step back and say, right, there's lots of different reports that we have to do to cover all these various aspects, but here's kind of where the board gets assurance that this and this is making a difference. I think that would be quite handy. Okay, I'm not seeing any other hands up for this particular one, so Bear with me a second. So we are being asked to note the content of the report, take moderate assurance that the content of the report provides confidence of compliance with legislation, policy and objectives, and approve the equalities outcome and mainstreaming report prior to submission and publication to meet our legal requirements. Are we happy with that? Yes. Okay, good. And then moving on in the equality suite, we have item number 14. So this is our equality outcomes for 2025 to 29.
Yeah, so this is the forward look in terms of setting out the outcomes we expect to achieve through the delivery of strategy, and here for approval today as a basis of how then we'll record against these outcomes going forwards. And as part of this, I think probably what we'll need to think about, taking your last point on board, is where some of this will need to go and how we partition it, if you like. So I think I'm quite clear on a lot of the employer aspects. It goes through our staff governance committee, and we have a lens to focus on those aspects through staff governance. I think probably what we need to have a thought about is the wider range of outcomes that would be referenced in relation to health inequalities, because they are so pervasive in our system and integral with population health as a whole, as a concept. Again, we've got had conversations around that board today. We probably need to be thoughtful about where does that get where does that aspect get scrutinised. It might be other existing groups, and we just need to think about how that fits within our board governance.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. And I think the way you phrase that actually is quite right. It's kind of how we've got all of this information. So it's like, how do we chunk it up in a way that makes sense and helps us to scrutinize it properly. Okay, happy to open up questions and comments. And I suppose just picking up Tim's earlier point as well, because I'd written in my notes here about the links, and I was just really mindful of Tim's annual report that he did this year about health inequalities and how we kind of tie that together as well. So I think that was helpful that we talked about that earlier. And there is a little bit in the S bar for this particular paper, you've got in there some of that linkage that we're talking about, so how it's complemented by the workforce strategy, the pay gap report, etc., etc. So that's kind of a start of a 10. Does anybody have any comments or questions about the outcomes going forward? We've possibly picked some of it up in the previous paper. Okay, so that's fine. We are being asked to take moderate assurance and note the content of that report. I think we can do that. Okay. So that takes us on now to item number 15. This is our Q3 report and annual report for 2024-25 for our Health and Care Staffing Act. Oh, sorry, Tim.
Yeah, just going back to the recommendation of the last one. So the recommendation, I think there was a bit of confusion between 13 and 14. So the recommendation on 14 is substantial assurance and to approve.
Have I got that wrong? Sorry.
I think it's in the agenda. It's listed slightly. Yeah, there's a slight mistake in the agenda, I think.
Okay, so we're being given substantial assurance and asked to approve the outcomes. Yeah, okay, my apologies. Are people happy with that? Right. Okay, thank you, Tim. Okay, so now 15, Health and Care Staffing Act.
Problem. Thanks very much. Just to note, this has been through both our Clinical Governance Committee for noting and for, both committees in a way in terms of discussion from different perspectives in relation to the Health and Care Staffing Act and the requirements placed on the board for this legislation that was introduced on and went live on the 1st of April of this financial year. Due to the reporting periods, we have to submit this in April to Scottish Government as an annual report. So although we haven't finished the end of the financial year, this is our annual report. So going forwards, we will report at the same period every year. So you'll get a year-on-year comparison. So it will effectively be done on the Q3 basis of the financial year, but in comparison to the overall calendar year, if that makes sense. So we have to stitch that together a little bit as we go. What we will do is provide a Q4 update through staff governance for anything that occurs in this last period of the financial year to make sure we're covering off that. But one of the aspects of this is that there is relatively little, one of the things we fed back to government is the requirement for quarterly reporting is quite significant. So, and do we actually see significant change between the quarters is one of the questions I would ask, but has been made back to government. So at the moment it's in the legislation, so we have to comply with that. But that might be an opportunity for future influencing on the periodicity of reporting. There is a huge amount of information that's been collated. Again, huge thanks to our lead on this and also all the teams that Bridie's led on collating, but the teams have all contributed across the organisation to gathering evidence. The challenge with this act is the scope and the range of it is quite significant, as you'll note by the duties, and there are two elements to where we need to progress in terms of strengthening our compliance with the act. One is being able to strengthen our system so that it's easier to gather evidence of what is in place across the organisation, and some of that is through digital systems and rolling out of digital systems. So in the absence of those digital systems, many processes are in place, but it's not necessarily easy to collate that in a systematic way across the organisation. So the rollout, for example, next year of Safe Care will be a huge enabler for us to be able to demonstrate compliance with the Real-Time Staffing Act. But it's just to provide a little bit of context so that the assumption is there are existing processes. So this is not new in that people do consistently look at what staff they have available on a daily basis, what the risks associated with any deficit they've got and how they're mitigating that. So, for example, bringing agency staff or supplementary staffing, that's like those sorts of examples. So just to give you a bit of flavour as the board as to why the landing on a particular assurance level is slightly challenging. So it's moderate in terms of the ability to demonstrate compliance with the range of evidence we have available, and moderate in the context that we are working to strengthen that, and that will lead us to a more comprehensive view of the system. But again, I'll not spend too much time because there's so much in there that I'm sure people will have questions. It's been broken down into 3 quarters, so to give a feel for the things that have been achieved over the course of the last year, and progress that's been made, and also what plans we've got for next year in terms of key priorities. And again, that feeds into our moderate assurance that we have a clear set of priorities for next year.
Okay, that's really good. Thank you. And you're right, again, another rich report which just scratches your brain and makes you want to ask lots of questions. I suppose
one final point, sorry, I was just going to say, the template which we have, I think some people will love the detail of the template, and others will get bamboozled by it. That is the prescribed template from Scottish Government that we need to use. So that's why when we've been presenting it through board committees, we have summarised it as far as possible and slimmed it down. But at the end of the annual report, we have to put the full detail in to the report. So hopefully that balance of you don't necessarily need to go into all of the details just to show you that it's there. The report is there then to summarise what the key points are from it. Sorry, Sarah.
No, that's helpful. Thank you. Yeah, you're right. Some people really love the detail, and some people not so much. I have a couple of questions, but I'll open up comments, questions about this item, or I can get things going. Let's see how we go. Okay, I'll start then. So I suppose just at that kind of higher level, not getting into the detail, really good to see, that overview RAG table early on in the S-bar. Great to see that that's moving, the colours are changing in the way that we would want them to change. So first of all, just to note that's really positive. A couple of sort of specific questions and then a bigger question. So I was looking down the list of key risks and challenges. So two kind of well, I'm not going to say quick wins, but 2 ones that stuck out to me was around Opal and where we are with rolling that out. I recognise that is just one thing, but understanding that could be something that really makes a difference. So just looking for some information on where we are with the Opal work, and then a bigger picture question, and this maybe will show my lack of understanding more than anything, is how flexible and agile this whole piece is. And I suppose when I say that, I'm thinking about the way in which we are looking to change our services, the way in which we're going to have to change our services, the potential around things taking on a different shape at a local level, but also taking into consideration what we talked at the top of the meeting, regional, cross-border. How well does this whole thing lend itself to us saying, actually, that needs to look different, and therefore we need a different calculation, as to what that looks like? Or is it trying to turn a tanker?
In relation to Opal, that is an area we will continue to progress next year. I think, interestingly enough, I think probably the key thing in relation to that is the balance between, is probably an overarching thing that certainly as an executive team we've been having conversations around whole system approaches. So it's about joining up, and I was out visiting one of the teams in one of the areas, and one of the conversations was really around it's both about relationships and how people interact within the system as much as the framework itself and the kind of guidance. So to put that in context, is it works well within a system, a subset of the system. So within Raidmore, for example, it's quite a robust, well established, well understood, and then within the different parts of the system there are elements where that's used similarly in RGHs and other areas and acute settings in the same principles. It's interesting that then how do you then balance off what's happening in different parts of the system? So it's multifactorial in its nature. So within a Raigmore, you're looking at the balance of risk across the Raigmore site, for example, and that's a dialogue, that's a conversation about where do we need to focus our effort and what do we need to do to be able to change our levels. So it's quite a dynamic system, but which involves people, and anything that involves people is also about relationships. So a part of that is also then having those conversations about bringing people together across the system, say how are we actually going to use this as a part of how we interact. So for example, when we need to step up assistance in another part of the system, what's the trade-off with other parts of the system. So it's a bit complex, but just wanted to put a bit of that context around. It sounds simple, so we're going to roll out the framework. The framework itself is rolled out a lot in a lot of areas. I think it's joining up that's the issue, and it's slightly challenging. The second point you made was how agile. Now I'll break that into two sections. One is probably the legislation itself is helpful in one way and slightly challenging in another. So it's not agile in the fact that if we want to change anything within the kind of the framework that we're working within, there needs to be legislative change. So that by its nature is not going to be agile. And the elements that particularly that stand out to me in that is common staffing methodology tools and the process that's built into the legislation. And how Healthcare Improvement Scotland are commissioned to develop those tools. Now, we were talking about this week. It is partly an art, part with some science behind it in terms of how you derive and come to what's an appropriate staffing level. And the tools themselves are being evolved and changed. So, but I think it depends on how, and the second part of the answer to the question is, so by its nature, there's a degree of inflexibility and lack of agileness around the mechanisms, if you like. However, how we approach it as a board, we can think flexibly about how we use those things. So again, if we use common staffing methodology as a way of looking at that, if we frame it correctly, then it is a tool that helps you have a discussion around what staffing do you think is appropriate, and it gives you a guide, but it's not a hard and fast, you will need X amount. It's been very clear since the legislation was introduced that it is not just about following a tool and coming up with a figure. It's about a conversation of saying this gives you an indication, and then there has to be triangulation with other data to come to an arrival of what's appropriate and sensible, because you can't design tools that are going to be suitable for every single context and setting that we're working within. If we do, we'll probably be waiting another 20 years to get all the tools in place. But we'll make use of the ones that are there. But I think the key thing is about how we approach it and how we frame it. And that's my response to that, I think.
No, that's really helpful, and actually that's actually really reassuring how you've described that, Gareth. Thank you. Karen, I will bring you in next, please.
Thanks, Sarah, and thanks, Gareth. It's my second time reading this, so of course I've got another question. I suppose it's that back to that thinking around from a health and care system perspective, and it's the Health and Social Care Staffing Act, but it reads to me as very much a clinically developed tool, and that makes sense if it's Healthcare Improvement Scotland that have been leading on this. And I suppose for me it's about how are we capturing, or are we capturing where there are health and care staffing risks across, and we know we are because we talk about them all the time, but across the social care elements of our workforce, and particularly how all of that aligns with statutory responsibilities, particularly in our social work areas. And is that, are we at that level, or is that a work in progress bit?
So you've hit on probably the conundrum, not the conundrum, that's probably not quite the right word. We have two different models of integration. In the context of Argyll and Bute, the statutory responsibility still sits with the council in relation to social care. The requirements placed on social care by the Act are different. So the lens we're looking through today is our board responsibility and as an employer. So in the context of that, it's demonstration of it has to leach across, if you like, or cross into social care. But I suppose that's the challenge of applying something in that holistic way. But the requirements that are already placed on councils in relation to the public health, the legislation, I'm not going to get the right piece of legislation. There is a specific piece of legislation that sets the requirements of what they had to do previously anyway. So instead of reinventing that, they've just said if they follow that. So the IJB will also need to look at how they get their assurance from the perspective of the council's responsibility. Similarly, we'll look at that from so where we're then looking at the lead agency model, we are taking into account that by the nature of we're being an employer. Hopefully that makes some sense.
That's really helpful, thank you.
That was very helpful, thank you, that's good. Okay, I'm not seeing any other hands up, so we are being asked to note the requirements placed on the board by the Act, take moderate assurance, review and scrutinise the information provided in the report, and approve the report. Is everyone happy with that? Great, thumbs up, good. Okay, so that takes us on to item number 16. And this is our employability strategy. So Gareth again.
Nearly there. I've got too many papers open now, so bear with me. Okay, again, I'm delighted to see this come forwards. One of the key things I was when I came into post just a bit over 18 months ago now, but was one of the things I wanted to be very focused on and develop a clearer oversight of all the things we already have in place and where our gaps are in relation to attracting people into our workforce from a diverse range of backgrounds. You can see again that's been a substantial piece of work led by well, it was originally both Gail and Megan were people partners. They have now transitioned into EDI lead and employability lead, respectively. So Megan Glass, again, want to put my thanks to her in terms of the work she's put into this and working with the working group, again, with input from a range of other people to the development of this, and the fact that it's very robust. So we're providing substantial assurance on the development of the strategy, take into account a whole range of views. And you can see in the paper in terms of how we've gone through that process, and the strategy, it speaks for itself in a lot of ways, so I won't go into that. I'll leave for people to ask questions, but I suppose the strap line for me is how can we get to the concept of start anywhere, go anywhere within the organization, that and really promoting points of access in, and on the equality side, we've got some real opportunities in relation to thinking about this through different lenses. So youth employment's one element of it, but also people, attracting people from other sectors that want to maybe change career in different stages of their life. Again, that's sometimes something we don't think about in terms of the things that impact on the ability to be able to go and retrain and do different things later in life when you have maybe a higher level of responsibility potentially, but a lot of our young people also have that. So there's lots of stuff to get our teeth into, but fundamentally this is about how we support people who are interested to come into health and social care. How do we support them to come in, and how do we support them to progress through the organisation to the level that they want to? And it's a real focus on grow your own and our employer responsibility in the area. I will note that Fiona has made some useful comments in relation to we do need to be thoughtful about how we work with partners. There is only so much of our local workforce that is available. So, we could all be chasing similar parts of the labour market that we need to be thoughtful about. So the employability lead is absolutely key to this, because it is very much about being out and about, speaking to a whole wide range of partners and looking at opportunities, because we can't do this alone. We have to work with others.
Thanks, Gareth. And that was a point actually I was going to make. So you've segued me into the point I wanted to make beautifully, is that something in a separate but related conversation at the last joint monitoring committee, we had talked about what you've just described there. We're all fishing from the same pool, and actually let's take a broader view of this. How do we, so this is obviously our employability strategy, which is great, but it's that bigger picture, working with partners. How do we get workforce into the sector? And if they come and work for NHS Highland, fantastic, but maybe also they go and work in the third sector doing something in health and social care, or an independent provider who's working with us. So I think that I'm really pleased to see that kind of recognition and appreciation of working with stakeholders and partners. We'll get them in somewhere, and they'll be helping support health and social care in our communities, and that's what's important. And I liked that tagline. That was, what was it? Start anywhere, go anywhere. That, I think, that was great. And I also, before I open up for questions, I was going to say I've seen some great stuff on our social media about the apprenticeships. So I don't know if people watch, but I like looking on our social media to see what's happening. And I've seen some really, really great stuff promoting the routes in via apprenticeships. So that was exciting to see that kind of in real life. Right, I'll open up for questions, comments, anything that people want to add around the employability strategy. Again, we might have covered some of it in previous papers accidentally. Graham.
It's such an important area, and we were talking about the issues that Gareth highlighted in Argyll and Bute about very limited pool, and both independent providers as well as ourselves looking for staff. I suppose the question relates to how much we have a differentiated strategy in the urban areas or the semi-urban areas, the rural, and then the remote, and they all seem to bring different challenges. And maybe they bring different opportunities as well, but at the moment it just feels like different strategies. So I'm just interested if Gareth can tell us any more about that kind of differentiation down at the front line of recruitment.
Yeah, I think that's a really helpful point, and I think for want of using a very glib term, there's no one size fits all on this one. So I think the principles, what we need to focus on in terms of what runs through, and I think what's particularly, I think it's what differentiates the areas in terms of remote. Then we tend to know that if people move out of the area, have to move out of the area to get education, to fulfill a registrant role, then it is difficult to get them back into the area. That's one aspect. So that's a key theme around promoting the earn while you learn, or the kind of opportunities to stay and be educated and within the system. But that doesn't have to be. I think it's probably more about how things need to be amplified in one area, maybe in a certain way, but they're applicable in all areas. Because I think again, it wouldn't be necessarily different in, say, Helensburgh, that if people have to go off to Edinburgh to do occupational therapy, they may not come back. So that's the aspect of it. So, but I think the other way of looking at it as well, the other is when people come into areas. Because I think that's also the thing that's important to me, is we do focus a lot about on youth employment at that end of the employment journey. I think there's also the other side of things, which is we do also have movement within our labour markets, and particularly with the economic regeneration concepts here. People do come with a family, and they come with, and that can be spouses, children, etc. So are we making it easy for people to be assimilated into different workforce sectors? So again, Graham, in our area, then Faslane is probably one of those that does bring a lot of people to the area. So what are we doing to focus on bringing people in that are dependents within the family that could be working for us? So I'm not sure we can stratify it completely, but I'll give it some thought.
Okay, there we go. It's back. Fiona, you wanted to come in?
Thank you, Sarah. So, Graham, I'm interested in that point that you've just raised, and I've been really particularly thoughtful about that recently, because I had a presentation shared with me from Highlands and Islands Enterprise that I think maybe I'd underestimated the scale of anticipated investment in energy, wind, offshore, renewable industries, that of course by the very nature of where the wind blows and where the sea goes backwards and forwards more quickly than other places, are in our more remote and rural communities. So that's an amazing opportunity for Highland and Argyll and Bute to have really high quality employment in areas where traditionally, or in more recent years and decades, we've struggled to offer high quality employment. But it is a real pinch point for us, where the pool of young people is already small, and we know that many young people are attracted to move to the bright lights in the big city at that particular part of their life's journey. And as a mum of young people that are just coming up to the end of their school years, I don't think I'm being dramatic by saying they're being bombarded with offers from local employers that are trying to show their wares and show the strengths of careers in their particular company, or indeed industry or sector. So I'm going to try and get colleagues from HIE to come and talk to the board in a development session, because I think seeing the presentations that we often see from Tim about health inequalities and challenges in our geography are really important, but we need to contextualise them in the reality of what's happening in our economic factors within Highland and Argyll and Bute, so that we can try and, where we can, pick our way as strategically and tactically to take advantage of the opportunities, and for them to mitigate our challenges rather than worsen them and exacerbate them, which would be the worst of all worlds. So I think your question kind of takes us in that direction of, how do we see what's coming? How do we work with the reality of our population? And then how do we tactically try and achieve the best outcomes across the range of our geographical settings. So I think this piece of work that Gareth's bringing to the board today is part of that, but it will need shaping and nuancing as we increase our intelligence and we get greater clarity about the economic environment, the climate, and where this inward investment is going to land across the patch. Thanks.
Thanks, Fiona. That's some really helpful context, actually. Gareth, you wanted to come back in, and Louise as well.
Yeah, I think complementary to that as well is that there was a report actually that was done some time ago. I think it was Joseph Browntree found out. Fraser Allender. They did it for, I think, Argyll and Bute, Inverclyde, and another council area. But they were looking at what factors contribute to economic regeneration in areas that have high levels of deprivation. I need to check whether Argyll and Bute was involved. Definitely Inverclyde were involved. But one of the key findings from that was entry-level jobs. So there's something around. We do have a large. We often focus on the challenging areas for us around registrants and the higher end pay scale. But we also know that we can provide some very high quality employment opportunities at the more what would be considered more entry level. In terms of, it's maybe not the right term. It's entry level in terms of how we view career pathways. And the reason why I say it's not necessarily the right term is because it's finding roles that people want to do and find fulfilling and vocational. And it's not all about registrant roles. There's a large volume of people that are quite happy to do things that are in a caring environment and working in a different way. So there's something for us about that other end of it. And I think there's something for us about, I suppose, bottoming out. How does the terms and conditions as an NHS employer contribute to economic regeneration in the area? So that does, I'm slightly at risk of going down a rabbit hole here, but fundamentally, it's about how do you get more jobs that are being paid at a higher level, kind of that median average, rather than median meaning more the average salary. And we could focus a lot on that as we can play a key role in that as an employer, because our terms and conditions are relatively good in comparison to some sectors.
That's a really interesting point. Before I bring Louise in about the terminology about entry level, and actually to pick up something we said earlier, language matters. And actually, as an organisation, as a system, we need people in every role, and that concept of moving people through a pipeline or whatever it might be, actually, you're right, can potentially be unhelpful, because we need everybody makes up part of what it is that we can deliver to our communities. So you're right, there's maybe something around the language there that's quite interesting. Louise, I'll bring you in, please, and then Steve.
Thanks, and apologies, I think I've got your sticky button as well here going on. And I suppose I was just reflecting on this in terms of some of the really successful work that's been going on Skye that Fiona and I hopefully be hearing more about tomorrow when we're over there, and just how things have turned around there a lot from the use and engagement and co-production with the community there, and I think there's something around, yes, we need to work in partnership with all of the partners and we need to understand that intelligence, but also what are the key sort of drivers in each of those local communities that we can really tap into. So we want an overarching look across and strategy about how we do this, but also what's that local intel and local ability to get the community involved and engaged in whatever plans we come forward with.
Okay, now that's really helpful reminder as well. Okay, good. Steve, please.
Yes, I think much of what I was going to say has been covered. Sarah, so when I looked at the key stakeholders on page 220, and HIE was kind of, we talked about this at staff governance about why we didn't have HIE in there, because they've done an awful lot of work on talent attraction, retention, returns, and I think that it's been a really helpful conversation, just almost starting to talk about private sector here, because I think in public sector we can be, we can be slightly myopic in terms of looking at the workforce, thinking about our partners and who they are. And I think Gareth talking about, that huge workforce that's about to come into the Highland demographic and the opportunities that that presents, and how we differentiate ourselves from the private sector. Not saying that a job in NHS Highland's any better, it's just different, and there's a different set of values within this organisation and that we can sell, and also some really strong terms and conditions of service. So it's how you articulate that and how because this is a competitive environment, and notwithstanding the opportunities that Gareth talked about with spouses and families coming in, we're going to have to compete for that young workforce. So I do think consideration of private sector, how we operate in that environment, and perhaps taking some good advice from HIE on this, because they'll be, economic development clearly is their remit. They'll be looking to support private sector, but also organisations like this that underpin everything. Because if you don't have a good health service that's populated with good employees, then we don't have a society, we don't have communities. So it's how we do that together. I just think that the element that's slightly missing is thinking about that wider workforce, how we work alongside the private sector. Don't just ignore it. Let's see how we can use it to our advantage. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Steve. And Alex, I'll bring you in, please.
Yeah, I can see the opportunity. The workforce issue, though, from what I've seen up so far, and bearing in mind we've got an awful lot of wind farms up here that are under construction, the vast majority of them have been built by contractors being brought up from the south to do the job. They're built, then they commission them, then they go. What you've actually got is 3 or 4 electrical engineers left to manage and run it. Now, the offshore wind farms, that's a different discussion. I mean, offshore West Orkney, 125 going up within the next 5 years. That's going to bring jobs because they need to be serviced, and that's not going to be from south. The issue, I think, where we're going to get an awful lot of people coming in is building the infrastructure. Because we've got the substations to build, we've got the DC converters, we've got the piles. There's a huge amount of work to be done in the next 5 years to be able to get that energy from the wind farms and the offshore wind farms down to where the population is. That potentially is an opportunity, but it's a huge threat in terms of workforce. SSE cannot get a Sparky or an electrical engineer for love nor money, and that's part of the problem that we've got. So yes, it's an opportunity, but believe me, it's a threat to the workforce as well.
Thanks, Alex. Gareth, and then we'll wrap this one up for fear of we could take this to lots of places.
I suppose probably coming back to a word you used earlier, which is agile, and I think any strategy needs to be agile. So we need to. I'll take your point, Steve. But this was probably a moment in time when HIE wasn't necessarily on the radar potentially, but I wouldn't say that as it precludes any other stakeholders being involved. It's probably just focused more on initially what is it within our gift and who are we directly working with at the moment. So that's probably just the reflection of one. I was keen to have something articulated what we do, but I would very much take an agile approach to this, that we develop this over time. And certainly I was one of the first to put my hands up to join the conversation with Fiona with it, Highlands and Islands Enterprise. So I think we've also got to be thoughtful about, we can't do everything, and we need to find that we know what our place is within the context, which I think is the point people are making. But we also then need to focus on the bits we can directly influence. So it's always that balance, isn't it, with the strategies, being able to be aware of the wider landscape and say, actually, what as an organisation are we tangibly going to do? And it's clearly within our gift to do over the next wee while. And then where do we need to develop that with partners as well? Hopefully that's a sort of helpful context piece to end on.
Thanks, Gareth. No, that's perfect. And I think, overall, the important thing here is that that we have the employability strategy, and that we're, similar to some of the other things we've talked about today, there are lots of questions and challenges and risks, but actually the important thing is that we have it, we're approving it, we're moving forward with it, and it's taking us in a direction that we want to go and need to go. So I think that's really positive. We are being offered substantial assurance and asked to approve the strategy for publication. Is everybody happy with that? Great. Right, Gareth, one more and then you get a break. So item number 17, this is our review of the Argyll and Bute Health and Social Care Partnership Integration Scheme for 2025. Gareth.
Thank you. So this was it's for the board here today to note the legislative requirements and timescale for reviewing the integration scheme, and to note their initial conversations so that the board were aware of the process we're undertaking. There are further discussions that I think need to take place in relation to how we align this with other things that are happening in relation to conversations around models of integration, both in our Argyll and Bute context and also in our North Highland context. So this is, I'm going to use the word again, agile. I think we need to just, if we have a group up and running, I think we have to look at whether we've got the right people sitting around that group and we've got the right framing of the conversation in the context of if there are to be any changes in relation to the integration scheme, and what factors might play into that in terms of what's unfolding in relation to other conversation around single authority models and the models of integration in the north as well. So just to note that there's further conversations to be had around how it progresses over the course of the year.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you, Gareth. And I'll open up for questions and comments. I don't know particularly if people who sit on the IJB have anything to contribute. Just to pick up your point there, Gareth, because I was going to mention this anyway, was clearly there's a lot of conversation out there about public sector reform, and single authority model is something that is being looked at in Argyll and Bute. And obviously you've kind of answered my question before I've asked it, but I think it is helpful just to flag that and to note that whilst they are two separate processes, and that, you know, there is the potential for some convergence. And I don't know, I'm not sure that we can maybe say much more about it at this point, but I think it's helpful just to put it out there. But I'm happy to open up to any other thoughts, comments, questions about that, or about the scheme review itself. Feels like just yesterday that we did it last time. Fiona.
Thanks, Chair. I think it's useful to note that the single authority model process is running along, by coincidence, the timeline that this scheme delegation review has been undertaken. Just to assure the board that last week, when I attended with Jerry the political meeting with Mr McKee and Mr Gray, we did bring to their attention, given that the focus of that discussion was around the single authority model, that we have this process that we're taking the paper on today, and of course the discussion about the integration model in Highland. So for us as an organisation, that's quite a lot of moving parts all at the same time. And I think it's important that the ministers have that oversight and understanding that what we're needing to be left with is a functional organisation with good governance that isn't made any more complex than some of our existing arrangements already are. So I think it's important we do note that. And there is, in my mind, an overlap in the Venn diagram of the single authority model conversation, and the degree of health alignment or agreement within potential models through that, as well as through this scheme of delegation. So whilst they are distinct processes, clearly we're talking about the same services. So yeah, we're going to have to be really thoughtful about how we ensure that those elements are considered wisely and with the best interests of the population in mind, and with the right people around the table. Thanks.
Thanks, Fiona. Okay, any other questions or comments about this? Okay, I'm not seeing any other hands up. So we are being asked to Sorry, lost my page. So to note the requirement for the review of the current partnership integration scheme that needs to be carried out by 23rd of March 2026, that the steps being proposed in regards to carrying out the review, including the formation of the working group as described, and that further updates will come through these governance structures. Are we all okay with that? Yep. Lovely. Thank you very much. Okay, thank you, Gareth. Sterling work. I'm going to move us on now to item number 18. This is our annual Code of Corporate Governance review, and I'd like to invite Ruth to take this item, please.
Thank you, Sarah. So yes, it's the annual review of the Code of Corporate Governance, which was considered and endorsed by the Audit Committee at its last meeting earlier this month. The report has been prepared together with in collaboration with finance colleagues to build the changes that are proposed for this time round. The agenda's got a link to the whole corporate governance suite of documents, but I haven't circulated all of that with these papers, but it's there for your information. There are some minor revisions this year to the Clinical Governance and Staff Governance Committee terms of reference, and there are some changes to the Fraud Policy and Action Plan, and those changes are predominantly to clarify the actions that are to be taken by staff relating to contact with the media in an event of a suspicious fraud or any suspicion of theft. So the board's asked to take substantial assurance from this annual update and approve the updates to the Code of Corporate Governance, which we will put onto the web once it's been refreshed. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you, Ruth. Any questions or comments on this one? No. Okay, so we are being asked to take substantial assurance from the report and approve the updates as set out, and note that the 2024 Code of Corporate Governance incorporating the full suite of control documents will be updated with those documents once we have approved it. Is everybody okay with that? Yep. Okay, lovely. Item number 19. So this is our annual board and committee work plans for the upcoming year. They're in front of us today to approve them. I'll take it as read and fairly self-explanatory. We've worked to try and get as much of these populated as possible so we can see what's coming for the year ahead, and also to try and minimise any duplication between committees. So the intention is that we will approve them today. Obviously, things will come up in a matters arising way that they do through the committees, but this is a good solid starting point. And the intention is that we will keep these under review and use our committee chairs group as well to make sure they stay coordinated as the year progresses. But happy to take any comments or questions. Okay, so we are proposing substantial assurance and asking that those work plans are approved. Great. Okay, and linking to that, we have a paper in front of you around committee memberships. As I noted at the top of the meeting, Anne's term comes to an end, and this is the shuffling about to fill the gaps that Anne's departure will leave, including putting new board members into positions on committees, including Dr. Neil Wright, who will be joining us very shortly. So you can see where I intend to place people on our various committees. And you'll also note that we are still holding a vacancy on our audit committee, as Emily referenced earlier on, but we are currently, or I am currently working with Scottish Government to recruit another non-executive member that will help plug that gap. But I'm happy to take any questions or comments. Okay, so I am proposing substantial assurance around that and asking the board to agree those committee membership changes. Oh, sorry, Jerry.
Sorry, Sarah, I was a bit slow. On the GMC, I think Tim's on it twice, and one of them should be Dr. Treon.
Because Tim's working so very hard. We'll put him on twice. Well spotted, Jerry. We'll get that amended. Excellent. Okay, so with that amendment, are people happy to approve? Fantastic. Okay, any other competent business before we close? No. So our next meeting is on the 27th of May at 9:30. Thank you everybody for your time today. Much appreciated, and have a lovely afternoon.
Bye, folks. Bye on time, Sarah.